I make this announcement today on the steps of our Parliament as notice to various organisations that masquerade as authorities to govern and adjudicate the academic, economic, health, religious, political and legal affairs of Australians that began with the removal of our great Commonwealth granted to Jewish Federation on 1 January 1901 by the Whitlam government, removed by stealth in 1973.
Right, greetings everybody. I'm here at Parliament House for the Rural Action Movement rally. It is chucking it down. And everybody's standing in the rain. It's pretty awful.
We are gathered here today because it is our right. This is our Parliament. And the people inside this Parliament are meant to do the will of the people. And when they don't govern for the people, we must gather together and put them on notice so they hear our voices. Let's let them inside know that we are here. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Aussie, Aussie, Aussie!
In WA, we've got some amazing leaders of our community and they have a wealth of knowledge. Now, they work incredibly hard to share that with us, and I'd like all of us to be very, very grateful. Last week, on these steps of Parliament House, we saw the repeal and apology. But what did that actually mean? As we stood here and we saw politicians on these steps saying this is a terrible bill, blah, 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 and we apologise. What a load of rot. They have had since 2021 with the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act to know it was unworkable, and they pushed it through. So today we are here to talk about ACTS the Acts. It's not one act. It's not just the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act. There's acts like No Jab, No Play, the emergency powers during COVID that they have now put into public health legislation. There are many acts that do not represent the people and do not stand up for our rights. So we have some amazing speakers today. Greg Kenny is going to be our first speaker. He is the president of the Rural Action Movement. So let's give Greg a massive round of applause.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you everybody that's here today. You've made the effort. It's greatly appreciated. Some of you have travelled over long distances. Thank you very much for that. The amount of angst that this Cultural Heritage Act has created in the community has really cut deep, I believe. It's created, or it's generated, so much friction. People that fall into the category of the Cultural Heritage Act, which is anybody over 1,100 square metres. Fortunately, the Act has been repealed. It'd have to go down in history as the shortest Act that's ever been enacted, 5 weeks. And you've got to question what a government is doing, passing acts that basically are unlawful. The other thing I'd like to make very clear, apart from welcoming everybody here, is that I want to make it clear that this meeting is not about an attack on the Aboriginal community. It is about an attack on our freehold title rights. I think it's really important that we differentiate the two. Today, Rural Action Movement, just briefly, it's been around for a long time. It started in the early 90s when we had interest rates that you couldn't bob over. We were shooting sheep. We had a few droughts. Price of wool collapsed. The grain price collapsed as well. And I don't know whether people, as farmers amongst you, would remember that period, but it was no picnic. Rural Action Movement was born out of that. It was very successful in its early years, and then it lost its way. I took over the Rural Action Movement 10 years ago. So that's the Rural Action Movement. The reason that Rod and I called the meeting today was, at the time, everything to do with the Cultural Heritage Act. As far as we were concerned, it was unlawful. It impacted on another act that exists, the Transfer of Land Act 1893. Essentially, the Cultural Heritage Act was unlawful against that act. And the Transfer of Land Act 1893 overrules Cultural Heritage Act every day of the week. When it was repealed, I spoke to Rod, and we decided that we would continue with this meeting. In organising the meeting, I have a number of contacts in the media world. The ABC, who are our main broadcaster, and we listen to them intently and believe everything they say. But anyway, no luck there. None of my contactors were interested. I was afraid that today there'd be just a handful of people turned up. However, I think we could all give ourselves a round of applause because a lot of you have made an effort, and I congratulate you for doing that. I'll wind up fairly quickly, but the reason Real Action Movement has called this meeting is because in the aftermath of the Act, I don't know what the politicians behind me think is a fair thing. An Act that lasts 5 weeks, there need to be some accountability for what went on. And the Real Action Movement is seeking some scalps. It would like the resignation. The resignation. Let me tell you who it is first. Resignation of John Quigley. John Quigley should never have allowed this to get into the Parliament to start with. That is his bloody job, and he hasn't done it. As far as I'm concerned, get rid of him, and that's something that Premier Cook must look at doing. He's embarrassed the Labor government and also the Liberals and the Nationals and anybody else that voted for the Cultural Heritage Act in 2021. So he's the first one. He's got to go. He's not doing his job. The second one, of course, is Booty, Minister for Aboriginal Affairs and a few other things. I don't care. He's probably a good bloke and all that, but he has got to go. The third thing that Real Action Movement wants is an inquiry into the Solicitor General's office. It used to be called the Crown Law Department. They got this really wrong. You know, it shouldn't take a couple of hicks from the bush. And there's a group of us, Rodney, myself and other members of our group, that stumbled across section 58, 63 and 68 of the Transfer of Land Act 1893. They are our freehold title rights. They're enshrined in legislation. They are sacrosanct. As far as I'm concerned, the Crown Law Department are not, the Solicitor General are not doing their job. They're another lot. The separation of powers is incumbent on the Crown Law Department / Solicitor General's office. Keep that separation alive and well. I don't know what went on. We have a government that has total power. They have both houses of Parliament in their control, and if the Crown Law Department said to them, you can't pass this act, it's unlawful, and they've turned around and said, you can go and get stuffed, we'll do what we like. If that's happened, we need to know, we need an inquiry to establish that something like that went on. So I'm not happy about the way that our government is behaving. It's a slight on our great state, WA. We are a really good group of people. West Australians do things really well. And what we do not want is a government in here making unlawful laws and acts. We do not want that. So that's why Real Action Movement has stood up. I didn't want to do this. I had a meeting in Esperance. I tried to get the message across to WAF, PGA, National Party, Liberal Party. They didn't get it. To come out publicly as it has, Rod and I got together. We both live in the Esperance area. We are here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. So the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act, they will tell you very proudly it took them 5 years. 5 years to create this piece of legislation. They weren't organised when they launched it. There were no larks. There was nothing set up. 5 years it took them. Imagine the amount of money they spent on it. I know the head of Department of Planning, when I met him at Albany at the information session, he told me this piece of legislation was going to cost $28 million a year to manage. Are the taxpayers happy with our money being spent like that? Me either. So our next speaker is Rita Mavaleskas. She is an affected member of the public. She is a bank warrior and she's also a criminologist. Rita?
hello everyone. This is a last minute thing, so I'm going to do my best, but it's very important that I get this message over to you all. I just want to welcome anyone from any of the Indigenous groups that have been affected by what I'm about to say, because I think that they are innocent parties in this as well. Now, 5 years ago, in June 2015, the state government signed an ALUA. An ALUA is an Indigenous Land User Agreement, and it was signed with 6 Indigenous groups over an area in WA that's north of Jurien, east to Merredin and south down to Hopetown. Now, this agreement, in exchange for $50 million a year for 12 years, a payment of $50 million each year for 12 years to the Indigenous groups, which is made up of convoluted contracts, agreements, deeds and things that people aren't supposed to uncover, is in exchange for the Noongar people will agree to A, surrender of native title rights and interests in respect to the settlement area, and to validation of all acts historically may have been done invalidly in relation to the settlement area. For instance, our properties. The government selling us our properties, which were native title. So they've got these 6 Noongar groups to release any liability to the government. The government's going to pay them. They've set up a trust. They've transferred 121 properties from across that area. One significant prominent large block on a prominent street in Applecross. Land areas in Noangara, Ravensthorpe, Albany, Mandurah, Coburn, you name it. They would have been put into a trust to earn the money to pay them. Now, this was done, the heritage law was done as a promise because the Noongar people were worried about the protection of their cultural sites. So this rubbish law that was supposed to be put in place to damage all of us and affect all of us, the government promised to look after those cultural sites, albeit the government under the original Heritage Act of 1972 under Section 18 has been blowing up and destroying heritage sites since 1972 with ministerial approval. But you were going to have to pay to put a shovel in the ground, to stick a tomato plant in. In relation to all of this, what the government has also done is put I think it's blanket. You're all going to have to check your own interest reports against your property through Landgate. I've checked several. They have applied a native title interest to all properties in this area in 2021. And at the same time, they extinguished it because of the agreement. This is done 6 years later. Now, if you all go to Landgate, as well as getting your Crown title, get your interest report, which they charge you $65. It will have a native title restriction on there, interest, which has been lifted. That's unacceptable. This is retrospectively 6 years later. Now, through this agreement, the Southwest Aboriginal Land and Sea Council Corporation, who has a record of all native title interests, novated their rights to the Central Services Corporation within this agreement, handing over all native title documents, maps, any information that the government could get their hands on. So the way that I see it is the Indigenous people will not have the freedom to spend this money. The government will dictate what they need to do with it. They'll have to put it into educational groups, community groups. The government will take a huge amount of fees and charges. The trust deed has Perpetual as the trustee. It's set up through securitisation just like all of our homes. It's a money grab. It's just for profits. That's all it is, at our detriment. That's why the law was put in place. So the law is unlawful, and you now have a native title interest on your property which shouldn't be there, because when you buy a property under fee simple, that distinguishes native title. So how can someone have a native title interest under their property title at Landgate? So that the reason why the law was put in place. It was to harm everybody, and it's unacceptable. Thank you.
How lucky are we here in WA to have such amazing people with a wealth of knowledge. These are also the knowledge holders that are sharing the information with us. But along with them sharing their information, we have an individual right, we have an individual obligation, a moral obligation to stand up for ourselves. So I just want to say it's great to see everybody here today. We weren't sure how many people were coming, but thank you very, very much. Our next speaker is somebody that most people here definitely know. He has a huge presence. He is the Vice President of the Rural Action Movement. He is a Commonwealth officer, and he is the founder of the Great Australia Party, Rod Culleton.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, I must say, wow-wee. Look at the presents. I've got goosebumps already, and I'm not doing it live, so it's not ad lib. First of all, I just want to make it very clear, this is the start. From small things, big things grow. And I wanted to start this in Western Australia because I am a proud West Australian. I stand here as a Commonwealth officer that represented you in 2016, although it wasn't the Commonwealth Parliament, it was the Australian Parliament, but I did take the correct contract to the Triple Crown, and that is what I will remain. And of course, another Commonwealth officer stands beside me, ratifies my work, and that is Len Harris, and I'm very pleased that he's been able to join us today. So he is your second witness. Okay, as we all know, a nation falls on the lack of knowledge, and I've really tried my best against the headwinds and the adverse media reports, who I do respect journalists, but a lot of the times they do ramp it up. But they have a job to do, and they also are Australians, but they are one-sided. They all are for what's behind me here. And I must also say what's behind me here is actually the Little League. It's not the league, you know, it's not the AFL where we play at the top level, and that's why 12 senators get elected out of this state to make sure that we go to a Commonwealth High Court of Parliament to hold these jokers to account, and that has not been happening because none of the other 11 senators in 2016 wanted to go anywhere near me. It was that bad I changed my brand of deodorant. Anyway, let's get into it, and I've written this is very important because this is the first announcement to go further for what we need to do as a nation to reclaim our rights. We were certainly Greg and myself down at Katanning, and I want to make it very clear the West Australian Farmers Federation, Pastors and Graziers Association, and the Nationals and the Liberals all sat down at Katanning with Little Proud, who does the country Little Proud, I might add. But they all sat down there and tried to invoke motions so that everyone would become subject to this hideous act, which of course hasn't passed the royal assent, which we'll get to. So it was no act at all, and that's why it's done it. It didn't do a backflip, it didn't exist. But the more important thing is, both Greg and I got up and opposed all the motions simply because it was un-Australian. So we managed. Anyway, they all got out on the front of Parliament, and the media came along and said, look at the heroes. They were holding up the motions that were all dismissed by, largely dismissed by Greg and myself. And then guess what? They get the accolade. But you know what? The Nationals, the bloody Liberal Party, and everyone that stood on that step voted for this bloody hideous act. Okay, so here it is. And I hope everyone's got my notice on Col Blanche too. So what we have here, I've titled Trespass and Suppression of Our Common Rights, 50-year legacy of Labor governments and 50-year conspiracy by the Liberal governments and others. To all my fellows Commonwealth Nationals, I better put my glasses on now. As a fully sworn qualified Commonwealth officer of the Crown of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland and Scotland, I make this announcement today on the steps of our Parliament. I did notice the other day, a police officer yesterday said, did we have a licence? I said, we don't require a licence. We pay the overheads for this place and we have every right to be here. I make this announcement today on the steps of our Parliament. As notice to various organisations that masquerade as authorities to govern and adjudicate the academic, economic, health, religious, political and legal affairs of Australians that began with the removal of our great Commonwealth granted to you at Federation on 1 January 1901 by the Whitlam government, removed by stealth in 1973. The Parliament behind me is financially supported by the people of Western Australia, and all those who claim to serve us merely are public servants paid by the taxpayers' purse, giving us the right to hold them to law pursuant to Clause 5, Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900, the founding deeds of this great nation. On the commencement of the British Act, being the Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act 1900, the Commonwealth as a body politic came into being and the 6 colonies became the 6 states of Australia, bound to that law, establishing the Commonwealth Parliament comprising the Queen, a House of Representatives, the Senate and the Executive Council, to which both Len and I contracted under oath to become duly sworn Commonwealth officers under aforementioned Crown. This unlawful act of the Whitlam government under Labor occurred 50 years ago, to which no jubilee is set this year to occur for this event, as it is not recognised at law, thus reverting the state, Western Australia, back to a colony. The reason you elect 12 senators out of every state and 2 out of every territory is for those people to attend under contract to the United Kingdom Crown to sit under the licence in the High Court of Federal Parliament to oversee the regulation of federal and state legislature, which we're here today to do, and oversight an executive government and a judicature being the courts of the state of Western Australia. This oversight is to make sure your rights are protected through constitutional guarantees at law, being a federal protection of the Crown of the United Kingdom and no other. In 1900 at Federation, the government was a servant class with the limitations set in the Constitution, being the title deeds to this country, to whereby this all changed in 1973, as stated earlier, and later through the implementation of the Australia Act 1986 UK by the states. The importance of this event today is such that the people must pay attention to the 2 dedicated Commonwealth officers who stand before you here today on the steps of your Parliament under their continued sworn constitutional duties and responsibilities to give confidence for you to reclaim and exercise those rights granted to you by your and our forefathers at Federation in 1901. What is a right? The Commonwealth is a right. Justice is your right. Property rights, money is your right. Self-autonomy is your right. And free speech in a democratic society is definitely your right. I reiterate, for the lack of knowledge, a nation falls. And as such, I, along with others, and my great team, Darren Dixon, Nil Pitchin, that are here with me today, and Len Harris, have, by example, been showing the people of Australia our law through the eyes of a Commonwealth officer by live streaming on social media and doing these very basic, these interviews. We as Commonwealth nationals, have not been given notice for the removal of our authority. This is the Commonwealth that runs the authority of the people under the constant guardianship of Crown law, where we recognise as a free people with common rights under sovereign being God. This ought to be reflected and registered on the minds of every man and woman on the land of Australia. Will concern us for our value and standards on how we will live our lives as free people or as people under servitude to the moneyed power which may consider us as property for security collateral to loans advanced to Australia, a corporation that's not a body politic, Commonwealth of Australia, established 1900. The performance of law. As a Commonwealth officer, there is a principle of law at the judicature level that we ought to be aware of that defines us and how we ought to decide our choices in following a mandate. It's found in the royal law of the Bible and supported by the ancient maxims of law, which say, "He who obeys at the command is the servant." Why this principle is of great importance is that the loss of our common rights being dictated by persons doing business as premiers of a state. This principle includes the right to a government that derives its throne from us, that extends to many and other rights over our body and our children, food security, our property, begins when we follow the mandates of others seeking to impose their will for whatever reason over us. For the state of Western Australia to exist, it must do so under the binding law of the Commonwealth. Due to the effects of federation, the Commonwealth is generally regarded as the more powerful partner, which removed all prior borders and placed them 12 miles out to sea, allowing West Australians, as a matter of right, to safely return home through the pandemic to the western side of our one self-governing colony, unfettered, as McGowan was mistaken in claiming a border existed in the jurisdiction of South Australia, some 100 metres from the political limitation, of course, which exists at the 129 meridian line, resulting in almost all cases being dropped by the police, prosecutors for want of prosecution under the Crown. And that's a fact. Protection of our rights. I'm nearly done. It reminds me of my maiden speech, actually. There's a principle to give careful consideration in regard which states he who fails to assert his rights has none. Simply, you cannot sit on your rights. And today is where we start to exercise our rights. Publicly, we must be mindful to protect our rights for ourselves as well as others. That includes our children and their children in the same manner and spirit that those have fought that very end in the past. For example, in our law under the Crown, we may have the courts observe and apply the principle of law. It's against equity for free men not to have free disposal of their own property. You would pay attention to the words free disposal as being without interference, affect the indefeasibility of your rights from any other, such as the current West Australian Parliament have attempted to do with the most recent Aboriginal Culture Heritage Act of 2021, and now the effects of the Electronic Conveyancing Act 2014, which has not received royal assent pursuant to Section 2.3 Constitution Act 1889 WA in order to become binding law. In other words, Landgate, get your hands off our true titles. Under a Parliament, under the standard of the Crown of the United Kingdom, these acts and all acts post 1986 would be held unlawful and invalid, as acts must comply with the contracting of the office of legislature, which we're here today, taken by oath or affirmation, for parliamentaries to actually sit, represent and lawfully serve us, the people. Both the Liberal and Nationals voted for the Agriculture Heritage Act, and through the West Australian Farmers Federation supported motions to have extended to all property owners, which I'm reiterating and mentioned earlier, which was circumvented by myself and Greg Kenny of Rural Action Movement. The Labor government dismissed the proposed act within weeks after being put on prior notice on the 30th of June 2023 due to not being able to receive royal assent in order to become law. This act was revoked on unprecedented terms on the good efforts of my fellow and all you fellow people going to Landgate. The people's power. For the first time in human history, the people with landholding rights came together to decide the form of government that they wanted. And that decision was honoured by the Crown through its Parliament at Westminster. So that power of the people would be enshrined into law, where that community would be a body politic known as the Commonwealth of Australia. Let me say it with legal focus that we Australians are the masters, called the Commonwealth, above and over the servant to be known as the government of the Commonwealth. Under the law of the Constitution, the government serves us. The Parliament makes laws to our advantage and protection. The Parliament representing the authority of the people has no authority to limit our authority and therefore cannot limit our freedoms. We have of late witnessed a number of West Australians, and I'm very proud of exercising their rights to their Crown titles, despite being told at Landgate that the banks have destroyed them and burnt them under instructions. That is larceny to permanently deprive. This certificate of title records true property ownership in English. And even if your name has not been entered on that certificate of title, it should be. Being in possession of your property is 9/10 of the law. The fact is the current state government has no jurisdiction over Crown titles and is in violation to 2.2 Constitution Act 1889, devoid of the Queen of the United Kingdom and her other realms. The importance of this law cannot be understated, and it manifests the importance of the critical event of 1973, where a government and a parliament that was the Commonwealth by nature and under the Crown of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland and Scotland in accord with the Constitution, introduced 1900, ceased to exist to be usurped and replaced with the government and parliament under invented and pretended authority and alternative office of the Queen named Queen of Australia, which has been accepted as a general acceptance and a truism to date. In order for the constitutionally valid Queen had to be sidelined and substituted with a new crown, which had to be invented, and that crown did not previously exist in the law of the Queen's 21-year reign, a crown known as the Crown of Australia. If one examines the foundation law of our Commonwealth, one would not only notice that the Crown of Australia does not exist, but the Commonwealth of Australia exists with the protection of the Crown exclusively. We may wonder, where did this change occur in law? For that is how a government and our parliament must operate. That change in law has never occurred. In fact, the current federal regime needing a legal document to operate with has been operating without a constitution since 1973, which marks 2023 as the 50th year of this pretended Australia under the attempted authority, Jubilee, under the attempted authority of the Government of Australia. Simply put, if the Constitution be observed, there has been no Commonwealth law since the removal of the People's Authority by substitution of the Commonwealth in 1973, which also happened here within the states in 1986. Contempt of either of the Constitution, the sovereign of the Parliament, or the Commonwealth is a serious crime, and federal governments and the members of the Australian Parliament are in breach of all the three conditions of contempt that may amount to sedition, and that's why we're here putting them on notice. I attempted to expose this parliament in 2016 and was quickly and brutally evicted under false pretences. This current illegal establishment wielded their substantial political power to shield themselves from exposure and accountability at all costs. But the overarching power that they attempt to harness is that of the electorate, and there is no mechanism at the moment to bypass the need for election in order to hold a parliament, and in that need is where our power lies. Our problem is one which rests on awareness by greater electorate, which is simply the lack of awareness of this hoodwinking of the Australian people when the government acting in place of a legitimate government pretended to be legitimate. In winding up, once enough of us understand this situation of a government pretending to operate under the law of the Commonwealth, the body of the people that is in us, there will be change. But we have to hit that mass awareness in order for the media to present the real issues to the broadcast. It's their silence to the issues that give this government cover. When McGowan claimed to have sold Landgate, he couldn't, as it wasn't the government's right to sell the land registry, to which the Crown itself cannot sell.
Which makes him a criminal!
Education will be our saving event. So attending today as a first step and sharing this message is critical, important, before the pretended federal parliament shuts down the opportunities down by the passage of legislation to suppress our right to share, communicate this very basic right. Should this legislation be passed and upheld by the courts, we're a short step away from full dictatorship by those who would have the control of government. I have met with the highest constitutional professors earlier this year, who I asked a simple question: are we operating under law of the Commonwealth? Their answer was no. It is clear the Emperor has no clothes, or in layman terms, the Scotsman has no bag or pipe under his kilt. I ask that all of you now serve a copy of my notice, 8th of August 2023, on Cole Blanche, the Commissioner of Police, and every person in this Parliament, and sign a petition for the lack of knowledge, as I reiterate Proverb 11:1:4, a nation falls for the lack of understanding. But more importantly, where there is no lawful legislator, the people fall. And may we say, God save the King, because nothing will save the federal and state governments. Thank you.
Can I just say something? Is that really the best applause that we can give this amazing man? Let's hear it.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General.
So to not put this to a vote is to concede defeat. You only win when you run on the field and engage. And let me tell you, my government is engaged. We're all in.
Monuments put front and to paper.